When is the last time you were in an argument that wasn't stupid 5 minutes after it was over? Take your time. I'll wait. The argument felt completely justified while it was running. The certainty was absolute. The other person was clearly wrong. The stakes felt real. The case was airtight. Then the temperature dropped. And the only thoughts left were your own. And you realized you weren't fighting the other person. You were fighting your need to be right. That's not a them problem. Here's the thing. If the argument was stupid 5 minutes after it ended, it was also stupid while it was happening. You may have sensed that in the moment, but not because the subject was stupid, because the other person was. You could see the stupidity, you just located it across the table. You know the right fighter. Every argument has to be won. Every disagreement becomes a case to be made. Every conversation that moves toward any kind of friction immediately generates evidence, precedent, and closing arguments. The right fighter doesn't argue to understand. They argue to establish. Establish what? That they're right. Which requires something to be wrong. Which requires someone to be wrong. Which requires a courtroom. The right fighter doesn't know they're running a courtroom. They think they're having a conversation. They think the stakes are the subject. The dishes, the tone of voice, the thing that was said or wasn't said, or was said the wrong way at the wrong time. The subject is never the subject. The subject is the need. Here's the part that makes this episode personal rather than observational. The right fighter in your life and the right fighter you become in the argument, same program, same default, same need, same courtroom, different sides of the verdict. Here's what the need to be right actually requires to function. A standard. Something against which the positions can be measured. Without a standard, there's no right or wrong, just different accounts of the same moment from different angles. A comparison. The positions have to be weighed against each other, which means they have to be treated as opposites, which means the frame that made them opposites has to stay in place for the argument to have any structure at all. A winner and a loser. Correctness is zero sum. If both people are right, there's nothing to establish. The argument requires that one position prevails and the other doesn't. And underneath all of it, underneath the standard and the comparison and the winner and the loser, the premise that something real is at stake, which is the only premise that makes any of it necessary. Remove the premise and the argument has nothing to stand on. Not because the subject disappeared, because the thing that made the subject feel like a verdict on your identity was never real. Which is why the argument was stupid 5 minutes after it ended. Not because you calmed down, because the premise that sustained it lost its temperature. And without the temperature, without the certainty that something real was being threatened, the need to be right has nothing to run on. Which means the certainty was never about the subject. It was the default program doing what default programs do. Here's what the self-improvement industry will tell you to do with the right fighter problem. Regulate your nervous system. Pause before responding. Breathe. Install better communication habits. Optimize your emotional response. Build capacity for discomfort. Develop the discipline to choose differently in the heat of the moment. All of that is hardware maintenance. The brain and nervous system are hardware, physical substrate, the equipment that stores and runs programs. Regulating the hardware doesn't touch the program. Optimizing habits is hardware maintenance. Installing discipline is hardware maintenance. Building capacity is hardware maintenance. The program keeps running. The default program is, I am not enough. That was installed before the hardware was fully formed. It runs underneath every argument, every verdict, every courtroom the right fighter builds, including the ones you build about yourself at 3 a.m. when the hardware is too tired to maintain the performance. The ego loves hardware maintenance. It creates an infinite loop. The hardware always needs more work, which means the program never gets examined, which means the loop never closes, which means the next product, the next practice, the next optimization cycle is always justified. Same operating system. The self-improvement industry just put it on a subscription model. You don't fix the program by maintaining the hardware. You see the program for what it is, which is exactly what happens 5 minutes after the argument ends. Not because the hardware regulated itself. Because the temperature dropped far enough that the program became visible as a program, and you saw what was running. Here's the distinction that the argument never makes room for. Right and true are not the same thing. Right implies a wrong. It requires the comparison. It requires the standard. It requires the premise that something real is at stake and that the verdict matters. Right lives inside a framework that needs all of those things to function. Truth doesn't require any of that. Truth doesn't need the argument to survive. It doesn't need the other person to concede. It doesn't need the temperature to stay high enough to sustain the certainty. It doesn't need a winner. Truth just is. Which means the thing the right fighter is defending in every argument, the thing the certainty was protecting, the thing the courtroom was built to establish, was never truth. It was the need to be right, which is the default program running, which is I am not enough, looking for a verdict that will finally settle the question. And the verdict never settles it, because the question was never about the subject of the argument. The possibility of being right is itself impossible given the limits of perception. Which means every argument built around the need to be right was built on a foundation that was never there. Truth doesn't need the foundation. Truth was already here before the argument started. It will still be here after the temperature drops. It didn't need the argument to establish it. You weren't fighting the other person. You were fighting the default program. The program doesn't need to be managed. It needs to be seen. Sit with this. Next time, let them.